Ja, probeer het ook in your pocket, your belt.
Let's just test the cover Nicolaides, right?
Cover Nicolaides.
The knapsack cover, President's Constraint cover Nicolaides lifting.
Complexity of lifting valid. The President's
I'm
Constraint.
prepared for that. I have my question.
Wow, yes, I can't even remember the time. Complex for me now.
You can whatever.
¿Cómo se pronuncia tu apellido bien? Van de Klundert?
Van de Klundert.
I won't be able.
Just try your way, it's fine. Van de Klundert. Does it work? Yeah, good.
Okay. Welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. It is my pleasure to present today Joris van de Klundert, who's been out for only a couple of days from the University of that's Saudi Arabia. Sorry, I don't know exactly. And he will be presenting today optimizing population screening for infectious diseases.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here, and indeed all the way from Saudi Arabia, from the Prince Mohammed bin Salman School of Business and Entrepreneurship. To present here work that I did, I'm a professor of operations at MBSC, as we call it, and the Vice Dean of Academic Affairs. But I'm also still affiliated with Erasmus University Rotterdam, where I used to work before, and where together with Albert Wagemans, you may know him, he's the chair of the operations research group there. We supervised a very talented PhD student, Harwin de Vries. And we present work that we did for his PhD thesis, or I will present work that we did for his PhD thesis and also continue to work on after he completed. Harwin, went to INSEAD when he finished. Actually, he's moving back to Erasmus. Albert is still at Erasmus. We collaborated, and much of the data and the problem was from the Royal Tropical Institute of the University of Antwerp in Belgium, and sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to some extent. And I'm from operations, and now it will be a talk about operations, but I hope you all feel strong enough to hear some scary details about infectious diseases and what they can do with populations, and help us or listen how we hope to eliminate these diseases by screening. That will be the topic of today. Before I go into that, actually, I thought it would be nice to talk a little bit about how I got to work on those scary diseases, and that's why I prepared this slide. I remember when I, at some point you start your bachelor program, you go to university, and you think that you want to do something with, that's your optimization, and make organizations or the world a better place, and then you get your orientation program, and you get these puzzles. And I remember that when I was 18-year-old, we started in orientation to work on the diet problem, right? Where you have to, the classical problem is from Danzig, actually. So you have to feed all the soldiers from the US that go to fight in the Second World War, and every day they need fats and proteins and calories and hydrocarbons, and you have to feed them at minimum cost, right? So this is a problem that you can formulate as an LP. That's what got Danzig also interested in LP to some extent, and it's an efficiency problem, right? How can I at minimum cost keep all these soldiers alive? And it's an efficiency problem, and similar problems that you start working on in your bachelor. For example, the shortest path, right? How can I get at minimum cost or at minimum travel from Rotterdam to Amsterdam? This is a problem that Dutch students particularly like because there's the algorithm of Mr. Dijkstra, who is a Dutch mathematician. So that is very nice to discover. And then there are more general problems like Minko's flow, or more complex problems like the traveling sales problem. It's traveling salesman problem where you have to visit all the cities at the shortest route. And still we are looking for efficiency and operational efficiency. And in my PhD thesis I worked on machine scheduling. I worked on efficiency in robotic cells. That was in the early 90s. Now you could say I was working on the fourth industrial revolution, where the robotization and optimizing robot moves. But again, to maximize efficiency, to minimize cost in a way. And as a result of the work that I did at that time for my PhD thesis, we worked for Philips as well. And we were trying to minimize the throughput times of their assembly lines where they produced color televisions. And so they had this, in these televisions they had the printed circuit boards, and you have to place like 300 or 400 components on these boards, and there were, you know, you have the sequence of machines and you have to determine which machine is going to place which component, and in which order do the machines place the components, and where do you store these component racks on the machines, and it was a huge problem. And we optimized this with all our operations research, we minimized all the movements, etc. And we could achieve a 20% efficiency improvement for Philips, and Philips was then producing all their color televisions in Europe, in Bruges, in Belgium. And so we were very proud that with all our mathematics and operations, we could, you know, achieve cheaper color televisions for the world. Basically, so we sold our work to them and published very nicely. And then half a year later, they closed the plant because apparently it was cheaper. They moved it to Mexico. And there the component placement was done manually. It was cheaper to have it done manually in Mexico than by operations research optimization automated in an automated way in Bruges in Belgium. And so that was of course a disappointment, but I think there's also a point to the story that it's this search for efficiency is in a way, it's a race to the bottom, right? I think this is words from a qualification by Michael Porter, that I mean, so Philips does it and then the competitors do it, and the price of the television goes down, so the consumers are happy, but basically there's no profit in it, there's no value in it. People lose their jobs because of efficiency improvement, and in a way so I thought this is not perhaps the most satisfying, you know, development in business to be part of. Are there more interesting things to do with operations? Are there more interesting or valuable contributions to make with what I can do? And so instead of minimizing cost and working on efficiency, I thought, you know, let's think about maximizing value and improving effectiveness. Of course, instead of cost, you can work on revenue or on yield. That's a simple step. Another program, what I worked on personally is, for example, on what we call the after salesman problem. So you have your customers, and now you need to service them, and you have to route your serviceman so that you maximize the customer value or the customer satisfaction of your customers, right? So whenever they need you, you want to be as responsive as possible. This is what we worked on, for example, for roadside services in the Netherlands. It got well published, and it was in a way more rewarding to work on. This was also, we did this work for a company that actually was a monopolist for a long time, and then new other companies entered their market, threatened them, but by improving their responsiveness of their serviceman, they actually could maintain their position and their profitability. Some 20 years ago, I think I was, for the first time, I'd been asked to work in healthcare, and I struggled a lot actually, because even though you are very clever, you know, or you may be very clever and have very important optimizations for them to offer, they are typically not very, or they may not be very inclined to accept that what you can do is actually better than what they have been doing. How can an operations researcher come up with a solution that is better than what the medical doctor has thought would be, or the hospital director, right? They are, I mean, patients are not color televisions, are also not cars. So what works, all these techniques of yours, they don't work with us. So I have had my disappointments as well, but after, you know, insisting, I thought this is actually something very nice to work on, very satisfying for me as an operations researcher to work on. So I insisted, and I think over the years we were more and more successful. I think it's also the acceptance is increasing for operations researchers. Now the time to work in healthcare is much better than it was 20 years ago. So this is an area where I really developed and worked and have loved to make the contributions. And one of them I will talk about today, and that is this population screening for infectious diseases. Healthcare is of course not the only area where as operations researchers, you know, we can try to maximize the value created for companies or for society. It is one of the sustainable development goals, relates very much to healthcare. Goal number 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. That is where, if we, with operations research or operations management, we can help delivering on the sustainable development goals. There are other areas. I just preparing my slides for today, I saw again that, for example, goal number 7 is about ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. So there are other people in the room here who are also can be filled to work on goal number 7. There's a goal, what was it here, number 15, forest management, which is also an area, right, that people here have been working on. So it's, I think there's lots of inspiration or inspiring areas here that operations research can contribute to deliver on the sustainable development goals. So for me, goal number 3 is one that I worked on a lot, and goal number 3.3 is about infectious diseases. And infectious diseases, so here's the specific goal. By 2030, the United Nations want to end the epidemics of AIDS, TB, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases, and combat hepatitis, waterborne diseases, and other communicable diseases. So AIDS, TB, and malaria are called the big 3, and together the neglected tropical diseases are considered to be the big 4th. Here are the list of, let's say, the official list of neglected tropical diseases. And okay, so one of the things that apparently we aspire to do is to end them by 2030. And today I will talk about how we can make advancement on ending these diseases. Ending them by 2030, I will also talk about, I think this is very ambitious. The WHO target derived from this SDG is actually very specific and very nearby. By 2020, we want to have eliminated NTDs as a public health problem. This is a very political statement, and I will talk about what it means, but it is a very well, ambitious and nearby objective that that the WHO is working on. And sorry, yeah.
NTDs are neglected tropical disease.
Yeah, yeah, very good. So these are those diseases. They should be eliminated as a public health problem by 2020. And actually, I don't know what shifted here. I will talk not about foodborne dermatodiasis. I haven't even heard of this one myself. I will talk about another one with a complex name. Would you like to pronounce it, Adriana? Human African trypanosomiasis. Typically it's called HAT or HAT, H-A-T, or sleeping sickness. It's known as sleeping sickness in the, that's the popular name. And I will tell you why later on. So here it is, here is hot. It is spread by the tsetse fly, like actually also malaria, for example, but there are other NTDs that are spread by some insects, so that's quite a general property. It basically occurs in this part of Africa. The number of cases in recent years, you know, there have been very bad years in the 80s and 90s where there were hundreds of thousands of cases reported. Now the number of cases reported is much lower, but that is also, it is also low because most of the cases are here in Congo, in the DRC, or in Sudan, where there are completely other problems that are worrying people, and there are many areas where nothing is reported at all, right? So it doesn't mean that the disease prevalence is low, but it's probably under the radar. It is a very difficult disease to eliminate because because of its two stages. Actually, because of the first stage.
This I should have done.
Can I get this back on? Do you want to do this? Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so in the first stage, you can have this disease for 18 months without actually recognizing the symptoms or even have showing the symptoms, experiencing the symptoms, right? So that means that you have the disease, the parasite is in your, it's a parasite, it's in your blood. Tsetse flies have, one or more have been infecting you, right? But others are visiting you and you are infecting other tsetse flies, and they may be infecting other people, right? Without anyone knowing that you're even ill. So that means that because, that makes it very hard to eliminate because you don't know who actually is carrying the disease. And then hopefully you find out and you get treatment, because after 18 months, and here it starts to sound a little bit scary, the parasite crosses the blood-brain barrier, it gets into your brain, and then the disease becomes really ugly. You get neurological disorders, and if not treated, you die in a very unpleasant way. So you can imagine that at some, you know, if in some years the prevalence is very high, the disease attracts a lot of attention, and there's funding, and people start treating it and screening for it, etc. And then the prevalence goes down, and people forget about it. The funding goes down, but the disease is still there, and it comes up again. And so this is very, of course, annoying, and you would like to eliminate it so that it's done once and for all. And that does mean that, so elimination means not only that nobody has the disease, but also that at some point none of the flies have the disease anymore, because otherwise they will, you know, keep it in existence. Okay, so here are the formal targets that the WHO has for HAT. They measure the number of cases reported annually and have targets on it, and they also have a target on the number of foci. So focus is an area, let's say a region in Sudan or a region in the DRC, where they consider the disease to be eliminated. And eliminated doesn't mean that nobody has it, but that less than 1 per 10,000 persons has it. Otherwise, how can you assess that nobody has it, right? That would be very difficult to finalize. But here you screen, and if during the screening you find that less than 1 case per 10,000, you say, okay, we have achieved our elimination target. It doesn't mean that it, yeah?
So how do you combat the disease? Is that through vaccination, or do you have to eliminate the focus of it?
So what you do is, I will tell you on the next slide. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay, so just to finalize this slide, we are looking to optimize the operations to fight the disease, right? So that the prevalence becomes less than 1 per 10,000. That's the objective of the problem that we are facing. And so what happens? Of course, you can wait for people to report to you, but then already they are in the second stage of the disease, right? So it's already very bad. They are infecting people. So this is called passive case finding, and it's not very effective. You will never reach elimination. So to reach elimination, you have to go out and to start screening people who are infected, but still asymptomatic. And then the test is not 100%, but the test is, let's say, reasonably reliable. So let's say 90 or 95% of the cases you can actually correctly diagnose. And then if you diagnose it, you send them, or you give them a medication, or you send them somewhere to be treated, and that solves the problem. It's relatively easy to treat the condition. Does that answer the question?
I was wondering if you can do something preventive as well, like vaccination.
No, vaccination. No, that's not there's no vaccination for HIT. No, for HAT. No, that's a good question. Yeah. No, and you can imagine that in most of these areas in Sudan and DRC and other African countries, there's not every village is a health center, right? So that means that if you want to go to screen these people, you have a mobile team that goes there, and so the deployment of mobile teams is very important in fighting the disease and in reaching the elimination of the disease. Okay, so the problem that we've been working on. I will come to that in a couple of slides, is how to do the operations, how to deploy these teams, how to route them, which villages to visit, etc. Typically, this research has been done by people from an area called computational biology or computational epidemiology, and they make simulation models where they simulate villages. So they simulate the inhabitants of the villages, and they simulate the flies, and then they have models in which fly, visit people and may sting or not, and then may infect or not, etc. And they simulate these things, and then they can really describe quite nicely how the disease spreads in a village, and also they can simulate what happens after you screen and not vaccinate but treat. So these are models that exist, but they are very descriptive. These are descriptive models, and they do not really help you if you have a large area and you want to know, where do I have to set my teams.
Does the disease move from village to village because a person moves or because the flies move?
Yeah, both can happen, of course, but typically flies are, I'm not an expert, but apparently flies don't fly that far, typically.
The mosquitoes that do that fly within about 100 meters of where they born.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's people moving.
Mostly, yes. Actually, there's quite a debate on whether this is the full model. For example, it could be that also pigs can be carrier of the disease or not, and it's not fully known what the reservoir of the disease, whether it's only man and fly and flies or vectors, right? As they say, and how it spreads, how the disease sustains over time. There's a huge debate about it, but normally it's people moving. Yeah, that's the assumption. Okay, so our role was, not to work with these models, but to take, let's say, an operations research approach. And so the typical questions that we asked are on this slide. Okay, suppose we have a set of villages where the disease occurs, or a region. We have screening capacity. We have screening teams. Which villages should they go and visit? How frequently, or in which months should we go to which village, so as to minimize the total expected prevalence level, and hopefully to eliminate it, right? So to reach a prevalence of less than 1 per 10,000. That would be the ideal. And to give you an idea of this is Congo, right? The DRC, which is a country basically the size of Europe. And at present they have 30 teams going through this enormous country, so there's quite some well, some decision space to consider, and that's yeah, I will tell you a little bit about how they route their teams right now, but it is a huge task that the WHO has taken on, and how to eliminate the disease here is of course very ambitious, as we may see from this picture. If you want to think about, you know, where to send these teams, of course you have to have a model that represents the impact of screening, and that tells you how the disease may develop after you have screened, and so from screening to screening period, how the villages will move. So that was the first step of our research, to get a predictive model for the expected number of cases in the planning periods, given our visits. And also, and I will talk about this a little bit if we have time, if you have such a model and you are routing these teams, you can also think about how many teams you would actually need to achieve elimination, right? With 30 teams in the DRC, is it enough for the WHO to achieve their targets? Or can we, and if not, can we calculate how many they would need actually to achieve their targets? Yeah. Yeah.
When the screening team reaches a village,
yeah,
can it reach every people there, or there is some?
Yeah, that's a good question. They can, but not every. So they call everybody, but not everybody shows up. I will talk about it later. So for the area that we have data, we know that around 75%, actually on average 71% of the people show up. Yeah, which if you want to eliminate a disease is not perhaps what you were hoping for. And then also the test is not 100%. So that's these are numbers that are very crucial and yeah, actually problematic. So it's a good question. Yeah.
There must be something else. Why don't we just go through all the cities? I mean, why is that a problem? Why don't we just enumerate all the villages and go to all of them in order? What's the constraint or the condition that makes the problem? Require an operational research solution. You see what I'm asking?
Yeah, there are. So the answer is partly here. The WHO recommends a screening interval of 1 year. So you go every year to the villages where you have seen a case recently. Once in every 3 years for villages that did not report a case in the last 3 years, but did report at least one case during the past 5 years. And then maybe villages where you haven't had a case in the last 20 years, right? So some villages are more urgent to go to, or some cities are more urgent to go to than others. So they all have, let's say, their village-specific build-up of the disease after you are screened, and that impacts how urgent they are to visit again. Does that answer the question?
No, kind of. I mean, we want to just sort them and just go to the one that. Go to one village, the one that has this condition first. And then, I don't see what the challenge is.
The challenge is there's a limit in capacity, right? So 30 teams may not be enough to actually.
It's probably with on the eastern side, you've got a war zone because of the Coltrane, and on top of that, I assume these things, the samples have got to be out of the team's hands within a few days. Can you hold them for a week or a month, or do they have to be chilled, refrigerated? Most biological samples are chilled before they're sent to the laboratory.
So, but for now, so here we focus really on the screening, and the screening is not. There's no issue. So if you want to talk about the treatment, right, then you need to perhaps be more careful about storage and etc. But that, I mean, as soon as you have identified who needs treatment, that problem is basically manageable. So
Did you go to the Congo?
Mm-hmm.
Did you go to the Congo yourself?
Harvin was in Congo several times. Yes. Yeah, of course you can.
It's really horrible.
Sorry,
Moving around is difficult.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
I don't think they can get teams to get around there.
No, these are locals. No, they do it. Yeah, it exists. Don't worry. But yeah, No, but the capacity, the capacity limitation is really causing, let's say, or is so demanding that you cannot just go everywhere all the time until it is eliminated. There's not enough funding to do so. Yeah, so what they do is, so here's a region, this is the Kremouth health zone in the Bandundu province, and here you see how the villages, they are typically spread out along the rivers, and so typically what happens in a month, you know, a team travels alongside the river and visits villages that they think need to be treated for 3 weeks, and then in the 4th week and the remaining weekend or whatever of the month, the team goes home, and then the next month they go to another river branch and etc. So what they do in practice, and this is also what we did in our formulation. So every month you allocate your teams to one of the areas, one of the clusters, let's say one of the river branches, and then within you decide which villages in this branch, in this area, you're going to screen. So you have to allocate teams to clusters, and then within the clusters assign the teams to the villages, so as to minimize the average expected prevalence. And hopefully if you do this for a while, you get the prevalence down to less than 1 per 10,000. In this area there are around 80,000 people, so here that means that you would want to achieve less than 8 patients, right? And then you would say that you have eliminated the disease in the WHO terms. Yeah.
So you're just screening, right? You said.
We were,
no treatment.
once you know, so you can send them to a health center for the treatment, right? That's not an issue, or you can come back. Someone else can come back and deliver the medicine. That is, but here we just screen. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so you minimize the prevalence, but for the prevalence, it has to be, there has to be some treatment.
Yeah. So we assume that after you're screened, the treatment is not an issue, which is it's not a strong assumption. That's actually.
Do they have health centers in this region as well? Or?
Yeah, there are regional health centers. So if people know that they have to go see a doctor, they can typically do that. Yeah. Okay, so that gives us this optimization problem, and now we have an operations research problem as we typically see it. So every time period we can assign teams to M clusters, right? So the sum of the clusters to which we allocate teams in each time period must be equal to M. Then with each cluster that we go to, we can select a number of villages that we visit, and the capacity asked by these villages, or the, let's say, suppose that we have 30 days, then and most villages probably will take, you can visit in 1 day, so the RV will be equal to 1, so we can, but some villages may take 2 days or 3 days, right, to visit, so we can pack villages within each cluster so that we are within the cluster, or within the capacity of the team assigned to the cluster. And we want to assign so teams to clusters and to villages within the cluster so as to minimize the prevalence of the disease in the area. That's the optimization problem, and the difficulty that we the first difficulty now to encounter is to specify this objective function. How do we model the prevalence level given that we visit these villages from time to time? And so this is work that Harwin did with people from Antwerpen and also from the Erasmus Medical Center, and we did a lot of econometric modeling. Basically for each village, the prevalence level depends on the number of people in the village. There's a ceiling, it's called the carrying capacity of each village, right? The village has a number of flies, for example, and if a village has more flies, then more people can be affected. Or in some villages, people may live more closely together, and therefore more of them will be infected if you don't treat them. Okay, there's a growth rate that exists uniformly for all villages. And so here the prevalence level depends on how many villages, or the total prevalence depends on how many inhabitants it has, the carrying capacity, the growth rate, and then some term which relates to your visiting frequency. So here, for between every visit, you get another addition or multiplication to the prevalence level. Yeah. Sorry. Right. Tau. Yeah, let me explain here in more detail. So suppose that we are initially at a certain level, then the disease will grow, right? The prevalence will grow, and initially it will grow faster and faster, but at some point it starts leveling off, because let's say most people that are prone to get the disease have been infected, so the remaining ones will not be impacted as easily. So this is a function that apparently captures very nicely, we estimated it incrementally, the development of the disease. It grows exponentially in the beginning, and then it levels off. And then, how can you model this? This can be modeled with a differential equation, which has the village carrying capacity and this growth rate that exists for the disease in general. And so we estimated these parameters, and we solved these equations for all villages. And then you can describe these curves nicely. And then if you want to see how the disease progresses, it develops until you screen, and then you have a reduction in the prevalence, and it develops again, and etc. Right? And then, so this relates to the question that we had earlier. What happens if you screen? The prevalence does not go back to 0, but to a certain percentage of what it was when you came. For example, only 70% show up, so 30% of the prevalence then remains, or some percentage remains. And also the test is not exact, so some people you screen, you think that they don't have the disease, but they actually have the disease. So then there's an impact, and so the time periods between the screening rounds, that's what the tau refers to, right? And if you let's say assume in your model that you have a fixed visit frequency, then there's one tau, but these screening intervals, there can be a number of them, so then tau is indexed. So here we sum overall screening intervals, right, from 0 to tau v, a term that relates to the growth of this function between the times that you screen. Okay, I don't want to talk too much about, let's say, the technicalities of the growth of the disease and the modeling of the prevalence level. What I would rather do is take this objective function for granted now, and think how, given this growth rate of the disease, how we can optimally allocate teams to the villages. So what it means is, suppose that we start here, the first time that we visit the village, this is the prevalence level that we encounter. No, slightly different. This is where we start. Then the prevalence increases. Here we visit it, we bring it down to a certain level. So that means that from there on, the prevalence starts again increasing. If we visit here again, we can get it down perhaps to here, and etc., right? So the disease moves along this curve, and hopefully for each village we can have frequencies such that we can get very low prevalence levels, and then ideally for the whole region we have a prevalence of less than 1 per 10,000. That's how we hope to do our screening. I'm not going to talk too much about these calculations. What we did here, if you assume that you can screen periodically, right? So we visit villages, some villages once in every 8 months, and others once in every 6 months, or 9 months, or 3.4 months, etc. Then you can analyze if your visit frequency is enough to eliminate the disease, to go to a prevalence level of 0 or to a positive constant prevalence level. And actually what we could analyze with these calculations and formulas is how many times you actually need to screen to get to elimination. And here you see, so this was an important result for the WHO, with a participation level of 70% or of 80%, that would be here. Even if your sensitivity of the test is around 100%, you need to visit the villages every once in every 1 or 2 years. So that means that visiting the villages once in every 3 years is not enough. And if your sensitivity is, for example, 80 or 90%, then even visiting them every year is not enough. So this made quite likely to the WHO that their current frequencies are not enough to achieve elimination. Even without thinking about how you deploy the teams, but just thinking about the screening frequencies, this shows us already that, that they probably need to do more, that their policies need to be more intense than they are currently formulated. How much time do I have until 1? Sorry, 10 minutes? Okay, so then I'm not going to talk about the capacity too much. Let me talk about how we then instead of looking at, let's say, assuming that we can visit the villages periodically, you know, with frequencies that we come up with, let us instead think about, okay, which are the villages that exist, and let us think about where are we going to actually send our mobile teams for every moment in time. So that is going back to this optimization problem. Right, so small instances we can solve. Really small instances with 5, let's say 5 villages and 1 year or half a year, we can solve exactly if we discretize the objective function a little bit, which can be done cleverly and quite exactly. We can do a little bit larger instances by column generation techniques, where a column would be for the planning period, right? A schedule for a certain team for the whole planning period. That would be a variable for the column generation model. But still you cannot solve even a realistic instance. Sorry. So what we did is we developed exact models with discretized objective functions, but this can be done without loss of generality. And we tried a quite extensive local search algorithm and found out that it's, at least for these modest instances, it really finds optimal solutions. So we use this as sort of our optimized solution value, as a reference solution value, to look at the larger instances, at the real life instances that we have. And for these real life instances, we also looked at practical heuristics. Because what happens is, these people that are traveling through Congo, they are not, they don't use that advanced optimization techniques to think about where they will go next month, right? So it would be really helpful if we have simple policies, like the WHO policies, go to these villages once per year, and then good simple policies. So what we developed is a set of practical heuristics, and we benchmark them against the solutions that we found by our, let's say, more extensive local search. And the first heuristic is what is called the equalize heuristic. Basically it says try to go to those villages that you haven't been to recently. So those villages that have been waiting longest, go there so that we equalize the frequencies in which we visit villages. Differentiate is a variation of that, where we actually mimic the WHO policy. Some villages you need to go once a year, others you need to go once in every 3 years, depending on how many cases you have seen in the recent past. So this is the WHO policy. And then we propose two different policies. The third one is go there where you expect to find the maximum number of cases. And the fourth policy is go there where by visiting you expect to reduce the prevalence the most compared to not visiting. So here you go, suppose that there is a cluster where you think you can find 30 cases, and this is the highest that that is available. You go to the 30 cases. Here you could go to another cluster, because there could be another cluster where the growth rate is faster, and therefore you go where you can have the biggest impact on the growth. Okay, remember that in this region there are around 70,000 people, 73,512. If you don't do anything in this region, over the 3 years, around 340 people will develop the disease, from the data that we have. In the optimized solution, this total number will be slightly above 100, and the prevalence level after 3 years is 80. Is this correct, what I'm saying? Yeah. No, I should say it slightly differently. Over the 3 years, if you do it optimally, the average prevalence level is slightly over 100 in the optimal solution, and the prevalence level after 3 years is 80. If you follow the WHO policy, the average prevalence level over the 3 years is almost 140, and after 3 years, the prevalence level is almost 120. So compared to optimal, the prevalence is, let's say, 50% higher with the current WHO policy. And that equalization is very simple and scores a lot worse. And here are the two policies that I introduced. So max cases, go there where you expect to find the most number of infected people. This is very close to optimal, really very close, within 1 or 2% of optimal. And go there where you expect to avoid the most cases. It's also quite good, but not as good as max cases or as optimal. So actually there's a very simple policy, the max cases policy, that is very close to optimal, and that is actually quite a lot better than the WHO policy currently being employed. I think that's a very important finding. We did a lot of sensitivity analysis. I'm not going to present the details of it, because you know, all these parameters that we estimated, you can argue whether they are correct. So you can ask yourself the question, suppose that the parameters are not correctly specified, would the policy still be effective, or right? And so the policies are actually quite robust, and sometimes the optimal solution is more sensitive to misspecifying the parameters than some of these the max cases policy. So both of these policies, well, their performance will not be worse if we know that we did misspecify the parameters, and actually, so their performance remains quite okay. I know I did not cover all the slides, but I would like to go to my conclusions. The first and most important conclusion that we delivered to the WHO is actually that what they are currently doing is, they can do a lot better than what they are currently doing. With a quite straightforward policy, go there where you expect to find the highest number of cases, and not, let's say, expect by expert opinion, but by the model that we estimated for them. And they can do that. They can start applying that if they want. So if for this region at least, all the data are nicely collected and estimated. The current thresholds and policies actually are likely to be insufficient for elimination and they are not as effective as they can be. So this is also an important measure. They had this objective of eliminating the disease by 2020 or even by 2030. What they are currently doing is not good enough. That is also very clear. And to give you an idea also about how good you need to be, if you want to eliminate a disease in this area of more than 70,000 people, you have to bring it, there must be 7 people, right? Or less. Then your prevalence is below 1 per 10,000. So after 3 years, in the optimized solution, we still have 80 people with the disease. So we are at a prevalence of 1 per 1,000, and we need to go down by a factor of 10 still. So the current capacity is clearly far from sufficient also. We are actually a little bit modest about conclusions at lower prevalence levels, because we think that the models that we estimated, etc., they may not be correct at all at these very low prevalence levels. Right? They're a little bit rough, and you need really refined models and techniques to be effective at these lower prevalence levels. Also, what we did, and I did not present it, but we did calculate bounds for capacity needed to reach elimination. And these can be very helpful, because remember what I said is that typically what you see is if the prevalence is high, there's a lot of funding, and there's funding for many teams, and then prevalence goes down, and then the urgency goes down, and there's less money for teams, and then the prevalence will go up again, right? So this is typically a political process. With the models that we developed, we can actually tell them, okay, you need 10 teams for the next 5 years, and then you can have your target. And if you do less than 10 years, the prevalence will go up again, and you will not reach your elimination targets. So this is another conclusion that we could draw for them, even though I did not present these calculations today. Okay, that's the story about optimizing population screening for infectious diseases. Thank you. Any questions still remaining? Yeah.
Can you go to the decision formulation, please? Just have a little question.
This one.
Yeah. So the decision variables here are binary, as you said, and I fail to see how they are connected to the objective function. Because we have x and y, which are binary, and
yeah.
the objective function, I don't see.
Yeah, no, you're right. They should have been there. So the connection is actually here. You could say, so suppose that we determine for each village when we visit, then we know the intervals or the interval lengths between the visits, and then we have these, we can calculate this term, right? Yeah. It should have been explicit actually, but it's not there. Yeah. Thank you.
I was wondering, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that immunologists were developing some simulation tools.
Yeah.
Is that possible, and does it make sense to simulate and to validate your optimal screening strategy within this simulation tools?
Yeah, you can use them as sort of a black box, and then, for example, you do sort of local search, right? So you.
What's your strategy?
Yeah.
Your screening strategy, optimal screening strategy. Implement this strategy within simulation tool, and to see how the disease evaluate in time.
Yeah. No, you can. And that, yeah.
And you did it.
And then you can also choose another strategy and simulate it as well and see if it's better, and that's what they do, but that is sort of an undirected search, right? Because you cannot use really, it's hard to use the information from the simulation to direct you.
Just a way to compare different strategies.
Yeah, it's done. Typically these people, they simulate at the level of one village, not at the level of a whole region, right? We included 300 villages or so. In a way, their models are much more refined. On the other hand, yeah, in the bigger picture, they are not that useful to help the screening team deployment. Yeah.
Very interesting piece of work, and I can understand how you would feel that it's very satisfying to have done that sort of thing. Would it be better, instead of screening everyone, to focus on certain parts of the population, like small children or adults in the 20 to 40 age range or something like that?
Well, I'm not a doctor, so it's hard for me to answer, but my answer would be that the flies are probably not very selective in age, right? So that would...
No, the flies won't be selective,
No.
as they're like the mosquitoes
But
in
it could...
Brazil.
Sorry?
As long as they're like mosquitoes in Brazil.
Uh-huh.
The impact on people
Yeah.
is quite different.
Yeah, so if we think that the burden of the disease is higher for children, then we may want to prioritize them. I think then prioritization would be to make sure that once you are visiting, that all the children at least are ready to be screened, right?
Something like
yeah.
that, which would cut down the propagation. If you get massive neurological problems with people over, say, 60, it's not going to cause as much problem on the work point of view because they're not going to be working in the fields, whereas the younger ones, people
Yeah.
20 to 40. I wondered if you could kill the impact with the same 70% visiting rate.
But I think, you know, so the problem in a way is not that people cannot be cured, right? So there's not that many people that actually die. But if you receive the diagnosis after, let's say in the second stage of the disease, there's a lot of suffering. But you can still be treated, and you'll be fine if you receive your treatment. So for this specific disease, the emphasis is really on, you know, let's eliminate it so that it doesn't come back. And I think if that is the focus, then you have to do all age groups, right? Because yeah, you cannot. I mean, every age group can carry the disease into the future, and then it's not eliminated. Yeah, if you have a disease where let's say the impact on the patient, the burden of disease is really important, and you want to, for example, children are more likely to be impacted. I think those are conditions where you would be more willing to distinguish age groups or other population groups than for this one. I'm not a medical doctor, so.
I want to go back to the prevention issue. So,
Yeah.
I know we have no vaccination, but are there other measures that the government takes, like either killing, like to kill the mosquitoes, or that people to change their habits, like in Brazil, for example, like they try to attack the dengue.
Yeah.
That is by telling people, look, not have standing water, for example, can be attract mosquitoes. There's things like that.
Yeah, I think that
would even help spread that.
I think there are even programs where they try to modify the DNA of the mosquitoes and the flies, and to try to immunize. Right? You could, if perhaps there's a vaccine that works for the flies. Yeah. People are working in those directions, which are also because they understand that this actual elimination is a very ambitious target that you may never achieve by screening teams. So they are looking for more advanced solutions in various ways, but really biological approaches then, right? Not yeah, often. Yeah, yeah. Well, I have, and for this disease I haven't heard. For TB you have this also. I think for TB, for example, the screening is very important. But then also people who are on medication, they don't complete their treatment, right? So that for TB, there's lots of this kind of education and health promotion work that is also done by the teams. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.